Well, let's look at where we are now with a historian. Stephen Wertheim is a historian of US foreign policy and an analyst at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome to DW. So we have Iran rejecting these US proposals and countering with its own maximalist offers. Now the US reported to be sending thousands more troops to the region. This doesn't sound like a war that's about to wind down.
It does not. Good to be with you, Phil. I see extremely little evidence that a diplomatic deal is coming together. At best, we're at the beginning of the two sides making contact. The United States, as you mentioned, put out a maximalist proposal, essentially calling for the satisfaction of all of Washington's grievances with Iran over the years: no enrichment of uranium, no missiles, no support for regional proxies. Not going to happen. Now, today, Iran has responded in kind, demanding not only no restrictions on missiles, but also reparations for this war, the ability to go control who goes through the Strait of Hormuz going forward, also not going to happen. So it may be that next week Iran and the United States sit down, perhaps in Pakistan, and open a dialogue. But as of now, if the proposals and counterproposals suggest anything, it's that this war is not likely to stop in the near future.
But here's the thing, not only about those offers and the counterproposals, but also about any prospect of talks between these two sides. It's hard to see why Iran would trust any offer that the United States comes up with, or indeed agreed to, given that the US was the prime mover behind the 2015 nuclear deal, which Donald Trump then tore up in his first term, and the fact that America and Israel started their bombing campaign during actual negotiations with Iran. Why would Iran trust an interlocutor like that?
That is a real problem. The Iranians have good reason to suspect that attempts to negotiate by the Trump administration are a ruse, perhaps meant to buy time so that forces can flow into the region in preparation potentially for an action on the ground with U.S. troops. But Iran has been burned by diplomacy with the United States. The United States and Iran did a pragmatic nuclear deal in 2015 under the Obama administration that just managed to pass muster in the U.S. Congress, but Republicans were heavily opposed to it. Many Democrats had misgivings. The deal ultimately failed, not because Iran didn't comply, but because, in a sense, it complied. And what enough influential people in the United States feared was an Iran that would be normalized in its influence in the region without a nuclear weapon, in my view. And so Donald Trump tore up the nuclear deal, said he wanted a new one, but has, in his second term, made demands like zero uranium enrichment, which Iran does have a right to do at low levels suitable only for civilian use. That was a kind of poison pill. And now twice in the midst of negotiations, the United States and Israel have attacked Iran.
You talk there about the way that Iran has now become viewed by American politicians, and I've been reading some of your writings, and you talk about how the toxicity of the US political establishment's view of Iran has effectively led to this war being inevitable because no reasonable deal could be done that would be acceptable to a bogeyman that has been blown up to such proportions.
Yeah, I'm afraid that looks like it's the case in hindsight. There was a good chance with the Iran nuclear deal, something I thought was an eminently worthwhile proposition. But I think in retrospect, President Obama said at the time, it was either the nuclear deal or war. In a sense, he was right. When the nuclear deal was ripped up, we've now got a war. But in a larger sense, he was also wrong. At the end of the day, a nuclear deal was tried. It was effective on its own terms, but it foundered when it came into contact with American politics. And we got both the nuclear deal and war. So I'm left wondering, what was the space between U.S. domestic politics and Iran's own ambitions, its domestic politics, if you will, to conclude a meaningful agreement that could get us off the path toward war, toward this problem festering until one day a more ambitious, radical leader decided he wanted to take action to try and solve it once and for all. That's Donald Trump.
Okay, so let's see if you can have a go at answering your own question. Is there an off-ramp for either side?
Well, in this conflict, I don't see many signs of an off-ramp right now. Iran, its priority is to reestablish deterrence, to make sure that if this current war ends, there won't be another attack in a few months or a few years. So I think Tehran is aiming to put strain on the American economy in particular to try to prevent that. Trump, for his part, has a poor record of concluding actual deals, never mind his rhetoric about always wanting to make a deal. So I think in this particular conflict, the best chance for an off-ramp is if Trump just decides enough is enough. He's won. He's going to claim victory. He wants to stop. He tells Israel to stop. That leaves Iran. Iran will likely continue to try to obstruct shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, but over time, its ability to do that is likely to diminish as more and more countries around the world tell it that this is a big problem and Iran should cut it out at this point. So I think the best off-ramp right now is actually a halt to the fighting by one side, hopefully followed by the other, as opposed to a diplomatic agreement. But that really just begs the question that you asked also, what comes after that? Right. There really does need to be a diplomatic solution to this problem.
But let's talk about Israel, which you said almost as though it was a given, and then the United States tells Israel to stop, and then everything proceeds. How likely is Israel to feel bound by a deal between Washington and Tehran? And is Donald Trump actually the man to stand up to Benjamin Netanyahu to make any deal stick?
Well, those are very good questions. I do think that in this case, what I envision isn't a deal between the U.S. and Tehran, but rather a U.S. decision to stop the war. And I think the United States does have a lot of leverage over Israel's government and Benjamin Netanyahu in particular. Netanyahu needs to run for re-election soon, and he needs Donald Trump's support for that. And at the end of the day, the United States has direct material leverage through aerial refueling and the like in terms of Israel's own ability to conduct attacks on Iran, as well as to provide air defense against Iranian missiles and drones coming to Israel. So, the U.S. has the leverage, but you're absolutely right. It's not a complete given that Netanyahu won't find some way to act as a spoiler.
Okay, you mentioned Netanyahu standing for re-election in Israel. Let's talk about American politics. I've seen polls indicating that anywhere between 53 and 59% of Americans oppose this war. With midterms in November, is that disposition likely to meaningfully constrain a president with approval ratings bouncing below 40%?
It certainly ought to. In almost any other circumstance, I would say yes, it will. The level of support from the American public from this war is historically low, and it's been dropping over time. But it's not clear that Trump is listening. His audience right now seems to be the history books, not actual living and breathing Americans. Whether it's with Greenland or Venezuela or Cuba or Iran, he seems to be trying to achieve big things to remake the map of the world so that he can become one of the great presidents of the United States, not just a two-term president. The other issue, I think, also is that global markets are so far behaving as though the war will end soon, and Trump has had some success in manipulating those expectations by market participants. And a lot of the economic effects of this war lie in the future, but Trump lives in the perpetual present. So I do think he will likely take these factors into account as we move forward, but it may take, unfortunately, a good deal of time for it to catch up with him.
Good talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Stephen Wertheim from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.